I was perusing the Epic Games marketplace recently, and I came across a game by the name of Blade of God X, and the artwork looked pretty damn cool, so I decided I'd give it a try. If you're familiar with my channel, you know that I already have experience with some gacha games and their mechanics, so for example, Watcher Realms, Raid Shadow Legends, all those sorts of good things, some of the big names out there, and this game is interesting. Now, I didn't see any sort of reviews or anything like that on it on YouTube when I looked. I did, however, see that there was very good reviews for it so far in the Epic Games Store. It has, I believe, a 4.8 star rating at the time of making this video. Now, it seems to be only out on Epic Games so far. I couldn't find it on the iOS Store, and I couldn't find it on Steam. It is present, but it's essentially just like a wishlist option at the moment, so it hasn't been released quite yet. So take that with a grain of salt. If you're watching this after it's been officially released on those platforms, it might be drastically improved. Now, I wanted to make a review about this game because it seemed odd that the star rating was so high for it, and apparently the users have had such a good experience, yet there was very little content surrounding it. So I went ahead, I hopped into it. I'll be giving you kind of my first impressions here. I beat the first kind of 2 to 3 main campaign stages, so a lot of the features that go along with that, I've unlocked, you know, the summoning and the cash shop and all those sorts of good things that you'd expect from a gacha game. So I have a decent amount of experience with it so far, and we'll be talking a little bit about the game. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the positives here first, and I gotta tell you, there's not many of them. So one of the things that I did like about it, though, is the setting or the theme is very enjoyable. It seems very akin to something like Dark Souls, specifically like Dark Souls 3 kind of thing. You know, the setting, and then especially the music with that. So the music is very, very pleasing to listen to, and then the music does complement the setting very, very well. So it's enjoyable to kind of immerse yourself in the world. It seems to be kind of like a dark fantasy, you know, definitely on the darker side. When we see games like this a lot of time, it's most likely comparisons would be something like Genshin Impact or Wuthering Waves, of course, and they're a lot more vibrant and anime-esque almost. So seeing a game that did something a little bit more gritty was pretty cool. And then, of course, the last positive thing here to say about it really is that the enemy/monster design is very unique. It's not really like anything I've seen before. So there's definitely some gods, there's some legends, those sorts of things, and then there's kind of just enemies that are entirely their own. They're not really, you know, taken from another game or seemingly from a mythology or anything like that. So I'll try to show, obviously, videos in the background of some of the boss fights and stuff like that. And then some of these boss fights can actually culminate in you getting that particular character for your roster, which is pretty cool. So, you know, it's definitely okay. Now, a little bit more context about the game now that we've got the positives out of the way is it is made by a developer called Void Labs. I couldn't really find too much information about them on Google. They do have like 3 or 4 game projects that they've worked on previously, but they seem to be mainly no-name projects, like very, very small-scale games, stuff I haven't even heard of before. So it seems that this is probably one of their big projects that they're undertaking. And I don't know how big the dev team is. So if this game was made by a solo dev or something like that, you know, it's going to explain a little bit more of the negatives we're going to talk about. But if this was made by a team, or certainly a fairly established team at that, it's questionable, to say the least. So the game itself is, again, kind of like a dark fantasy setting. The story seems to be based kind of around you're some sort of like a summoner who's come into the world to try and help them save it and repel some sort of, you know, evil that's coming over it. The gods are corrupted and all those sorts of things. The story was very hard to follow. There was not a whole lot that was really laid out in terms of like just, you know, it was basically just a bunch of dialogue splurging that happened, and then besides that there wasn't really much to go off of, so it was very, very confusing, to say the least. And of course that does now bring us to some of the downsides to the game, and my god, there is a lot of them. So the loading screens specifically could have just been straight up ripped from Dark Souls or any of the Souls games. Essentially, I'll try and throw some footage on screen of those loading screens. It is a bit of a shame because you can very easily tell that this game was inspired by that franchise or inspired by those IPs, and they've somehow managed to take that and take features from it and then just not really execute on any of the things that made those games great. So another part of it is the PC version of the game itself, so I'm playing it on Epic Games. It's very, very clearly a mobile port, which is terribly done. So a lot of the keyboard controls aren't laid out in an optimal fashion. There's not really any options or settings or those sorts of things that you can change, especially once you're in the game. So you have very rudimentary graphic settings, you have very rudimentary control settings, all that sort of stuff. And it's just overall not really made for PC, and that's very, very obvious. So we also have auto run in the game. Now, this is something that's present a lot in mobile games, of course. So this is essentially when you have a quest or something like that that is displaying on the top left-hand side of the screen. You can click on that quest, and if it requires that you go to a certain area inside the game, it's essentially just going to automatically path you there. It removes basically all of the brain power required from playing the game, and you can essentially just, spam it and click it, and it just takes you to the next spot. I know a lot of mobile games do have this, just so it can be a little bit more mindless, right? But then again, once you're bringing your game out on Steam, or in this case, Epic Games and those sorts of things, we'd expect to see something a little bit more involved. PC gamers aren't necessarily as willing to accept shortcomings of games like this, and when we're sitting down to our PC and we're playing a game, we generally actually want to be playing, not just, clicking and having the game play itself, right? That's not really fun for anyone. The graphics are incredibly lackluster, to say the least. So again, it is very clear, it is painfully clear, but this was a game that was made for mobile, and it appears to be a game that was made for phones from like 2010, because even the graphics, as far as mobile devices go, the graphics are pretty terrible in all honesty. So things are very faded, which certainly could fit into the aesthetic, but there's also just low kind of poly counts, it seems, so just there's not much graphical fidelity to it, and this is on the highest settings, so I maxed everything out essentially, and there's still just not really too much to look at. The special effects themselves are kind of just over the top, it seems, and I am playing on the Souls-like mode. When you go into the game, it's going to ask you if you want like a Souls mode, so it's obviously influenced by it, right? Or it's going to ask you if you want kind of like the over-the-top effects mode. I am on the Souls mode, but the effects seem to be just a lot of slashes and flashing lights and those sorts of things, and there's not really much substance to it by any means, so the graphics are just a huge letdown. When you look at the store page, the screenshots all look pretty good for it. Some of the footage looks pretty decent. Some of the gameplays on YouTube make it look alright. But once you're actually playing the game yourself, again, even on the max settings, it's incredibly ugly and hard to look at. With the game, there is a 60 FPS cap. You won't know this, though, unless you have some sort of frame rate tracker. The reason for that being so is when you launch the game, you have a few different FPS options, and those FPS options are labeled as like less regular or more FPS or max FPS or something like that. It doesn't tell you what the frame rate's going to be. I essentially set it to the max that it could go, and it was 60 FPS for me, which is a bit of a shame. And it's a shame because we have games and we have technology, even on mobile, that is very capable of playing things at higher than a 60 FPS frame rate these days. So I know, for example, like Raid Shadow Legends and all that sort of stuff, you can run it at 120 FPS, even on mobile devices. So for example, on my iPhone, it's capable. I know Android has been doing it for quite some time. So a 60 FPS cap doesn't really make any sense. You should be giving your players the option to play at a higher frame rate than that. The level design itself, it looks like it was done by somebody who's making essentially their first video game, or they asked AI how a level should be designed, and then they kind of just followed what it said. So the levels have no life to them, essentially. There's not really too much in terms of like, clutter and stuff like that around that makes these environments look like they're living, breathing environments or anything like that. You can very much tell that you're in a video game, a rudimentary one at that. There's just no reason to explore or to adventure or anything like that. So when you go into a level, generally there's going to be some enemies to fight, and then there is essentially just some treasure chests that are placed around the level, but there's not any sort of puzzles to it. There's not any sort of like secret, pathways or compartments or boss fights that you can miss out on or anything like that. It's incredibly minimalistic and straightforward, which you could argue that that's a good thing, but the levels themselves, it kind of goes back to the graphic side of it. They are just incredibly ugly. They're not really satisfying to look at or play through, and overall it just feels like it was very rushed or it was very low budget, and especially considering that it's a gacha game, it just seems like it's more of a money grab than anything else, as harsh as that might sound. Kind of bringing us to the last part of it here, so the combat very much feels like you're playing cookie clicker. And what I mean by that specifically is when you're in combat, there's not really any sort of feeling of impact or weight or importance to the combat, and enemies seem to have ridiculously high HP pools, even once you've upgraded your character and once you've upgraded your gear and all those sorts of things that you'd expect from a game like this, right? So essentially, The primary combat comes down to mashing left button while your cooldowns are happening, and then as soon as your cooldowns are off cooldown, or as soon as your skills are off cooldown, rather, you then start mashing your right button on mouse and keyboard, of course. Now, this is another issue with the game. So the combat is very, very rudimentary. It's very, very basic. Essentially, you have your left click, which is going to be your basic attacks, which do very little damage. You have your right click, which are going to be skills, which do a little bit more damage and have some effects associated with them. But you essentially have skill chains. So you do right click, it does this skill, then your next right click is going to do this skill, and finally your last right click is going to do this skill. And they always go in order. You can't select them, you can't seemingly change the order unless you stop the fight, you get out, and then you like select a different skill on your character, essentially. Now, essentially the way the gacha mechanics work in this is you can actually pull characters, then you can assign them to a skill, and then they kind of help power up that skill, which gives your character an overall boost to the power level kind of thing. So it's a very interesting mechanic. You're not collecting characters per se, you're essentially just collecting power-ups for your skill tree, if that makes sense, and then obviously duplicate characters, power them up, and make your skills a little bit stronger as well. But overall, it would be nice if we were able to select which skill we're using, so that if we're going against a certain enemy, because for example, some of my skills seem to be AoE effects, and it didn't really make much sense to use that when I was going against a single target, and then, you know, conversely, it didn't really make much sense to use a single target skill when I was going against a group of enemies, right? And since I couldn't choose, I essentially had to go through and use all those skills anyways. You do also have some counter mechanics and stuff like that, which would be similar to like maybe a parry or something like that from, again, you know, Dark Souls and those sorts of things. You're mainly going to use that against the bosses, though. The adds, or the smaller enemies, the minions, if you will, they're just essentially too weak to really provide any sort of a fight against you. So you're not really going to have to worry too much about that, right? Like, the fights go by pretty quickly. There is some treasure and stuff around the map that you can find like that. There is gear upgrades and all those sorts of things, again, that you would expect from a game like this. But overall, it was a very unenjoyable experience. I'll put some footage here on the screen too. The world chat is very, very quiet. There was somebody who had asked what seemed to be a fairly important question about the game in the world chat, and like 15 minutes went by, and then the next message was just me asking how everybody likes the game. One person replied, they said the game was very confusing, and that was about it, which I would have to say was pretty damn accurate, in all honesty. It's very confusing to me why the game has such high reviews when it's clearly not deserving of it. So kind of the final verdict on the game is, I would say, just go ahead and save your time. There's better options out there. If you're looking for an action RPG style game, go ahead and download something like Wuthering Waves, or, you know, God forbid I recommend it, Genshin Impact, those sorts of things, right? You're going to have a lot more enjoyment. They're a lot more of an established IP that continually gets updates. I would not be surprised if this particular game gets abandoned in the very near future, or turned into some sort of, like, you know, bloatware or spyware to, you know, get information from the devices it's installed on. Not saying that that's the case currently, of course. I'm not slinging any sort of accusations, but it definitely doesn't seem like it's going to be a project that's very long lasting. I would definitely love to hear from people down in the comments, though, if you do decide to play it, what you think. Or if you're already an established fan and you're seeing this video, definitely let me know if I'm wrong down below, right? So that being said, though, thank you guys all so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.